Humanity has been bestowed with great gifts. Perhaps greatest of all is our imagination, because ultimately it's our imaginations that enable us to shape the world around us. The most obvious examples of that are the great buildings and architecture all around us. But which works of architecture should we see during our lifetimes? Find out in Top 10, The Art of Architecture. Although the European tradition of opera goes back at least to early 1600s, the first purpose-built opera houses were only built towards the end of the 19th century. Before that, operas were performed in traditional theatres or other kinds of arena. Each of the 10 buildings in our top 10 is a wonder of stage technology, as well as a masterpiece of modern or historic architecture which fundamentally enriches the city in which it was built. La Scala, Milan, Italy. Milan, Italy is where you will find arguably the most renowned opera house in the world. For more than 200 years, it has been home to 3 celebrated theatrical companies: the chorus, the ballet, and the orchestra. The previous theatre, housed in a wing of the Royal Palace of Milan, was destroyed by a fire which broke out following a carnival gala in 1776. When the smoke had cleared, some wealthy Milanese who owned private boxes in the original theatre got together. They wrote to the governor of Milan requesting that a new theatre be built. A splendid new theatre at that. The architect, Giuseppe Pio Marini, was commissioned with its construction, and he had already been contracted to rebuild the ducal palace. The second in 2 designs by Pio Marini was approved in 1776 by Empress Maria Theresa herself.
It's been used to show something grand, to show how good the country is. It's part of our development, but in the end, it's always for the people that are going to be living in that architecture.
Piazza della Scala was the site of the new theatre. It's ironic that the church of Santa Maria alla Scala, which had given both Opera House and Square their names, was torn down to make way for the new building. The front facade may seem a little austere, but in that apparent simplicity lies the secret of La Scala's imposing presence. It is decorated by architectural elements that all conform to an established pattern. A simple ground floor with a projecting portico, a lavish first floor above it, adorned by rectangular and half columns, topped with decorations, and at the top, just a simple half-story. The triangular pediment in the center is adorned with a sculpture depicting the chariot of the sun being pursued by night. The Opera House was designed for 3,000 spectators, with building expenses part funded by the sale of private boxes. Commoners could buy a ticket for the main floor, where they had to stand to watch the performance. For the least well-off, there was a peanut gallery whose occupants were considered the most passionate spectators. Even today, They have been known to boo an actor off stage during a performance, thus forcing them to be hastily replaced. The atmosphere at La Scala could seem rather strange even in the 19th century. Mary Shelley, author of the novel Frankenstein, noted that on her visit to La Scala it had been almost impossible to hear the music because the spectators had been so loud. Arranging meetings, even making deals. This jolly mood often leaked out to the foyer where a casino had been set up. For an opera house, it was a racy kind of a place. La Scala opened with a production of Antonio Salieri's Europa Riconosciuta. But it is an Italian composer, Giuseppe Verdi, who was most associated with La Scala. Bolshoi Theatre, Moscow, Russia. Which came first, the performers or the theatre? In the case of Moscow's State Academic Grand Theatre, the performers. What is known popularly as the Bolshoi Ballet was founded in 1776 after a decree was issued by Empress Catherine the Great. The company began by performing at the Petrovsky Theatre until 1805, when the theatre burned down. For a few short years, they performed in the Arbat, a wooden theatre also destroyed by fires, set during Napoleon's occupation of Moscow in 1812. It would be several more years before the Opera and Drama Company could move into a new building, one designed in the style of monumental classicism. The history of the Grand Theatre building really started in 1819, when a construction tender was announced for the building. Although it was won by a professor at the Moscow Academy of Arts, his project never saw the light of day. The governor of Moscow, worried about high construction costs, entrusted the project to one Joseph Beauvais. The Russian-Italian neoclassical architect oversaw most of Moscow's reconstruction after the fire of 1812 and was a safe pair of hands.
This very hard it must be an architect, because it takes so many years when you plan it and you see it realized.
In 1812, much of Moscow had been decimated by Napoleon's incursion, including the fires which, quote, unquote, welcomed the Grande Armée as they marched into the city. The destruction left behind, ironically, an ideal building site on which Beauvais could construct the brand new theatre square, in the middle of which he situated the impressive Bolshoi Theatre. Its construction began in 1820 and was completed 5 years later. Joseph Beauvais conceived the gracefully simple yet monumental building as a traditional proscenium stage with a horseshoe-shaped auditorium for 2,000 spectators. The orchestra pit, located between the auditorium and the stage, was located in a purpose-built basement. During ballroom dances, it could be covered with a sliding floor. Joseph Beauvais had an innovative way to deal with the theatrical rigging system too. Instead of housing it in the customary tower and distorting the strict symmetry of the building, he designed a low superstructure spanning the entire length of the building. The entrance portico with its columns and a bronze statue of the Greek god Apollo in a chariot drawn by 4 horses is splendid. The first ever performance was held on June the 1st, 1825. Less than 30 years later, in 1853, a fire destroyed the theatre. The only parts left standing were the outer walls and part of the portico. The reconstruction of the theatre was carried out at an incredibly fast pace, so that on August the 20th, 1856, the birthday of Tsar Alexander II, the theatre was inaugurated. The roof, the pillars and walls were now all fitted with a richly decorated facade. Reconstruction brought about a number of renovations too. There was an increase in the number of seats, though the auditorium was still dominated by the so-called Tsar's Lodge, which was decorated with gold stucco. This symbol of imperial privilege was destroyed by the communists after the revolution of 1917. The original glamour of the dilapidated Bolshoi Theatre was brought back to life by the 2011 refurbishment at a cost of a mere 21 billion rubles. Palais Garnier, Paris, France. The first ever opera house to be built in Paris today bears the name Opéra Garnier in honor of its architect Charles Garnier. It is also a prototype of the kind of opera house which emerged in the latter half of the 19th century.
I think it's very good to have the history there, especially in Europe, where a lot of history were torn down.
It was really only in the second half of the 19th century that monumental public buildings became an integral part of modern European cities. These cities were undergoing a radical transformation from their origins as medieval towns. The redevelopment of Paris into a modern city was a passion of the Emperor Napoleon III, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. One reason for building the Opera House was said to have been an attempted assassination of Napoleon III in 1858, while he was on his way to the opera. The bomb thrown by an Italian revolutionary did not harm the emperor, but gave him the idea to build a new opera house. The site was chosen by Prefect Haussmann, who surprised everyone with a competition to select the architect anonymously. Over 170 architects applied, but the winning project was by a young and virtually unknown architect named Charles Garnier. He was under 40 years old, had only one previous design come to completion, and did not even have his own studio. He set up shop in little more than a garden shed and asked his classmates from École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, to help him. Construction was due to be completed in 1867 in time for the International Exposition, but straight away was beset with problems. The most serious emerged as soon as the foundations were dug. The issue was rising groundwater from the River Seine. The fire brigade was called in to deal with it, pumping it out continuously 24 hours a day. Garnier was forced to incorporate water reservoirs into his design, creating a sort of artificial lagoon. Fascinatingly, it was the underwater cellar and a later fatal accident involving a falling chandelier which gave writer Gaston Leroux story ideas for the Phantom of the Opera. Visitors who set off to Paris in 1867 for the International Exposition were only able to see the opera house from the outside. It was to be another 8 years before its richly decorated interiors were all completely finished. The neo-Baroque opera house is made up of several sections, and their boundaries are visible on the facade. Garnier was convinced the interior layout should be reflected on the outside. This way, distinct sections of the building correspond directly to their function. The first section, housing the foyer and a number of salons, is dominated by its majestic-looking corridors and intricately decorated staircase. The second section, the auditorium, which can hold up to 2,000 people, is capped off by a rounded dome in the manner of Italian theatres. The final section is the technical and administrative wing, more functional in design. The whole building is extended on each side by pavilions, which serve as entrance halls for VIP spectators. Garnier came under criticism for this, as the Emperor's Pavilion with access ramp disrupted the building's symmetry. In any case, Charles Garnier created a building synonymous with monumental architecture in the 19th century. Royal Albert Hall, London, Great Britain. In the unashamedly posh neighbourhood of Kensington in West London, you'll find one of the world's most famous concert halls. Amid royal residences, gardens, museums and luxury shopping streets, this cathedral of art and science was built between 1867 and 1871. It was named after Queen Victoria's consort, Prince Albert, who was very keen to promote the work of contemporary classical composers. In May 1851, London was the site of the first World's Fair, the Great Exhibition, for which the architect Joseph Paxton built the famous Crystal Palace. The exhibition was a huge success and gave Prince Albert the idea to build a quarter developed to art and culture. Soon a large site in South Kensington had been purchased, and the project, dubbed Albertopolis, was in part financed from the profits of the Great Exhibition. No cultural quarter would be complete without a concert hall. This one was designed by the architects Captain Francis Folk and Major General Henry Scott. Both were officers in the Royal Engineers, the British Army Corps. They were clearly influenced by ancient Greek amphitheatres and Roman arenas and by the Renaissance. But they were also inspired by the German architect Gottfried Semper, whose neo-Renaissance buildings can still be admired today in Dresden, Zurich and Vienna. This oval building of red brickwork has 4 monumental entrances, facing north, south, east and west. But apart from certain stone elements, such as the pillars, arched windows and entrances, the only real decorative element is the terracotta frieze, which runs in a band around the oval building and depicts the triumph of arts and sciences. Above the frieze is a glass and wrought iron dome, designed by engineer Roland Ordish, assembled in Manchester and then transported to London. When the time came for the supporting structure to be removed, many fled the site, thinking it would collapse. The Royal Albert Hall can accommodate well over 5,000 spectators. They come for the annual series of classical music concerts called the Proms, and for performances throughout the year by the big names in classical and popular music. Sergei Rachmaninoff performed here. Richard Wagner conducted his great works, and Albert Einstein led a scientific conference. Prince Albert's dream of a place where art and science could meet still holds true today. Teatro Colón, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Aside from its other attractions, the Argentine capital can boast one of the best opera houses in the world, the Teatro Colón, or Christopher Columbus Theatre, located in the very heart of Buenos Aires. The first Columbus Theatre was built in the 1950s in Plaza del Mayo, where today you'll find the Casa Rosada, the Argentine equivalent of the White House. The initial opera house building could host up to 2,500 people and served its purpose until 1888, when it was demolished due to the new building on Plaza del Mayo. The first stone of the new Columbus Theatre was laid 2 years later. It was intended that it would open its doors in 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. However, financial difficulties caused more than 15 years' delay. The original theatre was designed by the Italian architect Francesco Tamburini, who designed and remodeled many monumental buildings in Buenos Aires. Tamburini died shortly after the building works began, which were then taken over by his partner Vittorio Mino, also an Italian. In 1904, with the building still unfinished, Mino died too, in a scandal. He was allegedly shot dead by his wife's lover. Belgian architect Jules Dormal was asked to finish the project. The European architects separately and together created a building which, unsurprisingly, comes across as very European. The final touches under Dormal's supervision seem inspired by French eclectic architecture. Its horseshoe-shaped main hall has a vaulted ceiling with painted frescoes by French artist Marcel Jambon. Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico City, Mexico. The Palace of Fine Arts in the Mexican capital is deceiving. It looks as if it was built during the peak of historicism in the second half of the 19th century, when actually it was finished when the general direction of European architecture was set by Le Corbusier and the artists of the Bauhaus art school in Dessau. In the year 1900, due to the extension of the May 5th Boulevard in Mexico City, the old National Theatre building was swept away. It was decided to replace it with a building so splendid it could become a source of national pride. Plans for the eclectic building, which merges historicism and Art Nouveau, were drawn up by the Italian architect Adamo Bori. The construction of the palace, dominated by its tower and dome, began in 1904. The plan was to complete it within 4 years, but due to the complexity of the project, the 1910 revolution, the ensuing economic crisis, and Boy's return to Europe held things up. By the early 1920s, the unfinished building with the massive steel skeleton of its dome still resembled one huge construction site. Things only started to look up in 1928, when Mexican architect Federico Mariscal was put in charge of the project. He picked up where Boari's plans left off, but changed the interior style to Art Deco, which seemed somehow a better fit.
We need architects who are very sensitive to the use of the place.
The 50 meters plus high palace, clad with white marble from Carrara, Italy, was officially opened on November the 29th, 1934. There are three main parts: the central hall with exhibition space, a theatre hall with 1,800 seats, the necessary technical facilities, and an office and administrative section. Above the auditorium hangs a huge ceiling made from opal glass by the famous New York studio Tiffany.
I think you can see quite a fantastic continuous line of also change, but also based on the kind of the art it represents.
In the richly decorated interior, there are murals by prominent Mexican artists, the most famous of whom are, of course, Diego Rivera and Jose Clemente Orozco. The Palace of Fine Arts, which has been on the UNESCO list of World Heritage Site since 1987, is now the seat of Mexican national cultural institutions such as the Institute of Fine Arts, the National Symphony Orchestra, Dance Company and Opera, as well as the Museum of Architecture located in the space below the dome. Sydney Opera House, Sydney, Australia. The extraordinary Sydney Opera House, designed by Danish architect Jorn Utzon, captured the attention of the world. Its origins go back to 1956, when the New South Wales government announced an international design competition. Some 233 projects were submitted. What should have been euphoria for the winning architect, however, soon became a bit of a nightmare. An opera house designed by a foreigner was seen as an embarrassment to the conservative opposition, the Liberal Party. When they came to power in 1966, they dismissed Utzon from the project and put local architects in charge. The building was completed according to his design, but Utzon was shut out of the construction process, and so the disgusted Danish architect left Sydney, never to return. The Opera House is located on the harbour, close to the Royal Botanic Gardens and, of course, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It rises up from a large platform, evocative of classical amphitheatres as well as ancient Mayan architecture. Even before it was chosen, Utzon's design was controversial.
And actually it was thrown away from the competition, and then some in the jury saw the sketch, and here we have it. This will be the next opera in Sydney.
Utzon also drew inspiration from nature, originally conceiving his masterpiece as a set of seashells, their curves evoking waves on the ocean. But this visually pleasing solution proved a tough nut to crack, even for one of the leading structural engineers of the day, Ove Arup, another Dane, incidentally. Adaptations were made to the design, such as making the ribs of the lower shells from precast reinforced concrete. In service of what might be called architectural purity, Utzon wanted all the services and utilities to be located underground. But after his dispute with the New South Wales government, the interiors were not constructed according to Utzon's plans. Yet despite all these problems, few would deny that a visit to the Opera House is a one-of-a-kind aesthetic experience.
And when you come into the opera, it's wood, beautiful wood, but it's also glass high up. So then you see the people moving on the outside. And then you see people in almost like a performance.
The project suffered lengthy delays, which unsurprisingly had a big impact on the budget. Formally opened by Queen Elizabeth II in 1973, building costs exceeded the original budget of $7 million Australian dollars, more than 10 times. The finished opera complex covers almost 2 hectares with 5 concert halls, a recording studio, restaurants and exhibition space. Concert hall audiences may also admire the world's largest mechanical pipe organ, which has over 10,000 pipes. In 2007, just 1 year before his death, Jorn Utzon had the satisfaction of seeing the Sydney Opera House listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Walt Disney Concert Hall, Los Angeles, USA. One of the newest major concert halls in the US, glitters even by the standards of Tinseltown. It's the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, designed by architect Frank Gehry. In 1991, Lillian Disney, widow of Walt Disney, donated $50 million to get the project up and running. For the then 62-year-old Frank Gehry, it was a return, in a sense, to his roots. Gehry had designed his first buildings in California, especially in Santa Monica and Los Angeles. Those early designs followed a cheerful postmodern style, but even his later works have a certain playfulness. They were also user-friendly buildings.
If you have an agenda, you'll fail. So you have to have a purpose and a promise and a hope, and you bring your talents, whatever they are, to the table, and you respond to the clients and their needs.
When construction started on the Walt Disney Concert Hall, Gehry was already designing buildings in France, Germany, Spain, and the Czech Republic. The turning point of his career was his work on the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao in Spanish Basque Country. Completed in 1997, the Bilbao is probably Gehry's signature building. His deconstructivist designs were made possible by utilizing the latest technology, especially computer programs. All of his works stand out in the crowd.
For many years, it was very popular to be very integrated. You know, you shouldn't see what is art and what is the other things. And then, of course, one gets a little bit fed up with that. So now I feel it's getting more vivid. One can really make special thing that stands out, but at the same time talks with the building, for example.
In 2001, Geary started Geary Technologies, which has been at the forefront of developing computer software for building design ever since. With the Walt Disney Concert Hall, Geary was able to repeat the success of his work in Spain, covering the facade with a stainless steel skin. Most of it was given a matte finish, but the Founders Room and Children's Amphitheatre were both covered with highly polished panels. These, however, reflected so much sunlight that nearby pavements and buildings started to overheat with the increased risk of traffic accidents due to the blinding glare. Geary's company developed a computer program to analyze the glare. Eventually, they were able to eliminate the glare by lightly sanding the offending panels. But what about inside? Well, all the experts agree. The acoustics of the auditorium at Disney are of the highest level. Designed as they were by Tokyo-based studio Nagata Acoustics, their sound designs for concert halls with a vineyard seating plan is reputedly second to none. None of this came cheap, however. By the time of the opening ceremony in 2003, the budget had soared to $274 million. City Hall and private sponsors contributed to this figure, and the Disney family and Walt Disney Company put in more than $100 million. But Los Angeles gained a concert hall of world renown, and Frank Geary showed yet again why he is one of the leading architects of our time, immune to popular trends and not prepared to sacrifice style at any cost. Copenhagen Opera House, Copenhagen, Denmark. The Royal Opera House in Copenhagen is located on the seashore, on Dokkorn, meaning Dock Island. It is just opposite the Rococo palaces of Amalienborg, the residence of the Danish royal family. This stunningly impressive opera house was designed by the Danish architect Henning Larsen and sponsored by the Molar family, who donated it to the nation. The super-rich shipping family sunk $500 million into the project. So far, so good. Except its construction became a source of heated debate.
They were not happy with it, and the architect who made it didn't want to sign it in the end. So I think that had been quite a lot of discussion, and so it lost the energy, the opera house.
There were some who considered it a Trojan horse rather than an act of philanthropy, probably because of fears of high operation costs and the sponsors' unwillingness to compromise on any detail. They insisted on the best materials and implementation, which meant that everything had to be tested during construction. This was not to the liking of the architect, yet the building was completed in 2005, having taken just 4 years to build. And so Copenhagen gained not only a remarkable architectural work, but an opera house with several cutting-edge features. The front of the huge building is not unlike the bridge of a big container ship, perhaps one from the Mollard family's highly successful shipping company, Maersk. Traditional material, principally stone, is much in evidence. The limestone cladding both suits and contrasts with the dynamic central section of the front facade. This was designed by a convex glazed wall assembled from rectangular panels laid sideways. Behind this transparent surface is the central foyer, which provides splendid views of the Danish capital as well as the main auditorium. Larsen designed the interior in a similar manner to the exterior. Apart from steel, glass and polished wood, the predominating material is, in this case, Sicilian marble. It is enhanced by numerous works of art by leading artists from Scandinavia and across the world. Among these is the unusual main curtain, designed by Per Arnoldi, who used an optical illusion to create a three-dimensional effect. The illusion is so complete that it deceives not only the naked eye but also the lenses of cameras, which are virtually unable to capture the unusual effect. The Opera House has one principal auditorium with one main stage, but 5 other stages adjoin it, which means that scenery can be moved simply and quickly to the main stage during a performance. This allows the opera producers to use 6 main sets for any one performance. The building's 1,000 rooms have a total floor space of 41,000 square meters, and the main auditorium can seat as many as 1,700 people, depending on the size of the orchestra. On that note, part of the orchestra pit is located underground, arguably the only blemish on the otherwise completely unique opera house, which is, at least for now, the most expensive in the world. The National Center for the Performing Arts, Beijing, China. The National Center for the Performing Arts, or the NCPA, is located in the heart of old Beijing. It is close to the Great Hall of the People, Tiananmen Square, and the ancient Forbidden City. The decision to build the Grand National Theatre in a place of such historical and symbolic importance says a lot about the high expectations for the institution. The NCPA was designed by French architect Paul Andreu, with construction beginning in December 2001. Paul Andreu believed that while there is value in traditional Chinese architecture, Beijing must also present the best and brightest in modern architecture. His design is certainly contemporary, and yet with its large open spaces, water and trees, was designed to complement the red walls of ancient buildings and the Great Hall of the People, to blend with its surroundings and not overpower them. NCPA officially opened in December 2007, and as cutting-edge architecture in Beijing has yet to be surpassed.
I think that the people of Beijing are very curious about it. I think they want to come into this building that they've seen from the outside for weeks, even years now. They want to come in and have a look.
The oval-shaped titanium and glass shell encloses an opera house, a concert hall, 2 theatres and several public spaces. Surrounded by green lawns and gardens and an artificial lake, it is seen as a cultural island in the middle of the bustling Chinese capital. The huge silvery construction has a total area over 215,000 square metres, with an underground car park alone of more than 45,000 square metres. Note the theatrical motif of its exterior. The outer titanium shell is broken by a glass curtain, suggestive of a stage curtain going up. Around the lake is a green belt, conferring a sense of serenity amid the hustle and bustle of a modern city and anchoring the NCPA in a tranquil green garden. Guests only arrive in the building after walking through a hallway that goes underneath the lake. Quite a talking point during the 2008 Olympic Games.
The Olympic performance season will, on the other hand, intensify the atmosphere of the Olympic Games, and on the other hand, it will provide friends and visitors from all over the world a perfect site for them to enjoy arts.
It is certainly busy these days as the Centre for the Arts. The Opera House is the centre's largest venue, hosting elaborate productions, while the concert hall hosts symphony orchestras and national music performances. The multifunctional theatre consists of 2 lifting platforms that can be elevated as needed. There are also a number of public spaces designed to amaze and stimulate, jointly known as the 5th space. They include the underwater corridor, the Olive Hall, an exhibition gallery, a resource centre, terrace lounge, souvenir shops and cafes. The 5 buildings you have seen in the second part of this program are at the very pinnacle of contemporary architectural design. Some of them have been constructed in a relatively short time, while others took several years to finish. However, they all represent the very best of the best and have, without exception, brought great cultural riches to their respective cities.